everyone. Welcome to another live stream on the History By podcast. And today I'm joined by Professor Jennifer Glancy. And today we're going to be discussing slavery, Christianity's moral problem. And I'll have the links to purchase her books titled Slavery in Early Christianity and the R1 Slavery as Moral Problem in the description below. And it will also be in the pinned comment if you want to go purchase them. And we'll be live for about 45 minutes. So if anybody wants to ask any questions, make sure you get your questions in. Super chat questions will be prioritized. And that being said, Jennifer, thank you very much for joining me today.
I'm happy to be here. Thanks. Thanks for the invitation.
Thank you for joining me. So I want to focus first on Paul's letters. Paul's letters are generally believed by the vast majority of scholars to be the earliest Christian text that we have. And so I want to start with Paul. What were Paul's view on slavery? And my second part to that question is, generally, like, Christian apologists often say that, no, the New Testament doesn't condone slavery. And they're kind of like imposing their current views onto the text. So what do you make of all that?
So I guess I'm going to try to start with the question maybe about Christian apologists, and I'm going to work backwards to Paul. So I guess I have to say that I am a Christian. And so I actually think that as a Christian, that has to be compatible with honesty. And I also think that slavery is completely inconsistent with anything I hold to be morally true. And yet I'm dealing with texts which very often just sort of accept slavery as a fact of life. And so that's the moral problem. For me, it's very parallel to some of the ways I struggle as someone who cares about equality for men and women. A lot of these texts just have gender norms that are really out of line with mine. So how do I inhabit that as a woman in the 21st century who's also, considers herself to be a member of the church? So I think it's a really parallel problem. And so I just have to go back to, Christianity. If for those of us who are going to seek to live this authentically, it has to be consistent with honesty, and I am rejoiced when I can find sparks of liberation in these texts, and I do, but I also have to look at the ways not to judge these texts by present standards exactly, but really to say, how have these texts fed into certain patterns of thought that persist in the church and persist more widely in society, so that we can begin to rectify that. And I can use some technical language for that later, but that would be for me the moral problem. How do we confront these texts are supposed to proclaim the good news? How do we deal with the bad news that gets mixed in? And is very much mixed in, and is not easy to separate. So does that, in terms of the apologetics part, does that give you a sense of where I'm coming from? So in terms of Paul's letters, one thing I would start by saying is, well, who says Paul had a view on slavery? To begin with, I think lots of us have lots of views that are really, really, really inconsistent. Someone who was close to me in my life used to say, I don't believe in anything after death. When you're done, you're gone. And she also went to a psychic to communicate with people who were on the other side. And I'd say to her, like, okay, so you believe that when you're dead, it's all over, you can go to a psychic and talk to people on the other side. So I think that people on lots and lots of views, and I don't mean to make fun of this person, and she's now on the other side herself, and maybe she's frowning at me, and, presumably she can't really see or care, but that's another matter. But I think lots of us hold inconsistent views on lots of things. I think that Paul thought through certain issues systematically. I think he thought through issues related to Jews and non-Jews and how they related to the people of God. And I think sometimes that's opaque to us, but he had put a lot of thought into it. I don't know that he put a lot of thought into the question of slavery. I think it came up in the course of his communications, and he had to say something. But to assume that he had a systematic starting point to begin with is not one that I would have. I would expect that, like a lot of people on a lot of issues, you just really haven't thought through all the ramifications. Like, you're a vegetarian and you like Parmesan cheese. Okay, do you know that's made with rennet, which is an animal product? Okay, I'm still going to eat Parmesan cheese. Like, I just think a lot of people are inconsistent on a lot of things. Does that
Yeah.
Makes
I get
sense.
what you're saying.
And so I would also, again, I'm speaking about Paul, I would always stress that I'm primarily talking about the letters that are agreed by Pauline scholars to be authentically by the Apostle Paul. And those are First Thessalonians, First Corinthians, Second Corinthians, although that's kind of a patchy letter, Galatians, Romans, Philemon, and Philippians. There are other letters that are attributed by Paul, and I would contest their authorship, but I guess I would generally say the authorship is contested. That there are some scholars who might argue that Colossians or Ephesians is written in whole or part by Paul. So it's not that I am absolutely right and everyone else is wrong, but that's important to stress because there are different messages about slavery in the letters attributed to Paul and in these other kind of secondary letters.
So would you say that there's a problem with, like, when people argue with each other about, okay, does the New Testament condone slavery? Does it not condone slavery? And you would say it's not as simple as saying it's all a yes or all a no. It's more nuanced and complicated.
I would say that, I think for people who are looking for ammunition, you can find ammunition in those texts. And you can certainly find ammunition. And certainly, I think it's really important to say that. So here are some of the things that really, really trouble me. For Paul, certain sexual behaviors would put you outside the community. Those sexual behaviors might include, I don't know, sleeping with your father's woman, whatever that means, wife, concubine, partner, would put you outside the Christian community. Okay. Paul did not think that slaveholding put you outside the Christian community. And so I think that really, and you might say, well, how could Paul have taken a stance against slavery? And that's one way he could have done it. He could have said, I can't control what happens in the wider Roman world, but I can say, if you're a member of this community, you can't claim legal title to another human being. And he does not do that. Certainly Christians were slaveholders. It's painful for me to say, but there is no objection to slaveholding per se in the New Testament. There's no sort of clear holding, don't do this, the way that there are clear injunctions not to engage in other behaviors. And that just simply does not appear in the New Testament.
How do you look at the letter to Philemon when Paul is saying that he says something about Onesimus and that and he wants Philemon to take care of Onesimus? And some people will say, okay, there it is. That right there is evidence that Paul doesn't have an issue with slavery. What's your take on the whole Onesimus thing?
Boy, is that a tough one. And I think that this is a case where this very specific letter immediately gets into a situation where we want to have some broader principle. And in fact, Paul is addressing some issue that has arisen, and he's trying to do that in a particular way. So I'm not sure exactly what Paul is asking in that letter. I should be clear. There is one argument. There's a scholar, Ulrike Roth, and I have a lot of respect for her. And she argues that it's possible that given the structure of the language of koinonia in that letter, it's possible that Paul's even a co-owner of Onesimus. So that's a possibility. Do we know that for sure? No, we don't, but the reading is actually consistent with the Greek of the letter. I think that Paul is asking for something. He's certainly asking for, and there's also another minority view associated with Alan Callahan that, in fact, and others as well, that Onesimus is not enslaved at all. But I disagree with that, but I think it needs to be pointed out that people have read it as saying that people have read that letter as suggesting that this isn't about slaveholding at all. I don't agree with that. I think that Paul is asking certainly for clemency for this enslaved person. I think it's possible. Catherine Shaner has argued that Onesimus may have been ministering with Paul, with or to Paul in prison. And that's a really interesting possibility, because one role that enslaved persons sometimes played in ancient and Roman religions was as sort of religious figure, sort of functionaries. So did Onesimus share in that ministry with Paul in some way? There's a whole range of possibilities. If I had to make a guess, my gut sense is that he's asking that Onesimus be returned to him to continue to work with him or for him while he's imprisoned. It may be that there's a request for Paul's manumission, for Onesimus's manumission. It's really, really hard to say. That's another case though too, where it's under Roman law, if Onesimus came, and I'm assuming some knowledge of most of your listeners about this letter, the backstory that's frequently posited, it's not really spelled out, it's sort of assumed, is that somehow Onesimus has escaped from Philemon's household and has found Paul in prison, where he is baptized. And that does seem, I would seem to say that that does seem to be the case, that Paul has baptized Onesimus, and that Paul thinks that the baptism of Onesimus should change the way he is treated by Philemon in some way. But what that is remains really understated. And as I said, I think it's a plea to have Onesimus return to him. It may be a plea for manumission. It may be a plea for something else. But it's a very opaque letter. It's based on all sorts of understandings between Paul and Philemon, to which the modern reader doesn't have access. However, one thing that is interesting is that in Roman law, if indeed Onesimus had fled from Philemon's household, which is possible, if he was, we could say, you could either say he was a fugitive slave, or you could say he was, making an attempt at self-liberation. You could say that he was escaping the human rights abuse of slavery, however you want to put it, that he ends up with Paul in prison. Under Roman law, Paul would be obligated to return Onesimus to Philemon as the owner, as the slaver. However, under Jewish law, under biblical law, fugitive slaves were not, you did not return an enslaved person who left the slaver's household. You did not return that person. Now, there's very little reason to think that that particular aspect of biblical law was in force in the first century, but I will say that that's another move that Christian readers often make, is to assume that Paul is acting in conformity with what they think biblical law, the law of the Hebrew Bible, says about slaving. And so that's a move that I would say, I think that there's a lack of clarity actually about what the Hebrew Bible actually does and does not say about slavery. And also a question like something where the Hebrew Bible is clear that if an enslaved person has managed to escape from a slaver's household, especially if that person, I think, would be a fellow Israelite, that person should be given shelter rather than returned. There's now really evidence that you can point to in the first century to suggest that Jews are practicing that in any wide scale way, or that Paul would have felt obligated to do that.
Are the pseudo-Paulines more specific on the issue in any way, or I should say what is believed to be the pseudo-Paulines? Are they more specific on the issue at all, or are they just as ambiguous as the other letters?
Yeah, so that's really interesting. Absolutely. You get in Colossians, Ephesians, and what are called the pastoral epistles, 1 Timothy and Titus, 2 Timothy as well, what are called the household codes. And the household codes really suggest that, well, I want to suggest that there may be really a shift in the way the early community understands itself between Paul's generation and the generation of what are we called the Deutero-Paulines, the letters that are ascribed to him. And so increasingly, a lot of scholars argue that in the generation of Paul, the community claimed for itself the name of ecclesia, which is frequently translated church. And as I say to my students, as soon as you say church, I think, there's a gut reaction that you think that building at the end of the street or at the end of the block, or, a little town in upstate New York where there are like 20 people in 5 churches. So you think of a building, or maybe you think of a particular configuration of a community. But ecclesia was a political term, and it was kind of it was a participatory space. And the ecclesia, which would have been in a Hellenistic city, every member of the ecclesia had a voice, could speak, and there were power relations within it, but it was a participatory political space where points of view were negotiated. And so you have that, I would say, in Paul's generation is that's the term, the ecclesia, that the community claims for itself. So when we get to the Deutero-Pauline letters, again, Colossians, Ephesians, and then the pastoral epistles, 2 Timothy, Titus, there's much more of a sense of household structure. And so we have household codes. And now the church is going to be run like a household, but this is household as hierarchical structure. And so there is a head of household, typically male, and he is responsible for keeping everyone in order. And everyone has a role within the household, but it's a very specific role. So the role for the head of the household is to control other people. And obedience and respect and fidelity would be required of the other members of the community. And so that's where you get much more straightforward statements of slaves obey your masters, don't talk back, don't steal. Really minimal, sort of like, as slavers to the slavers, treat these people kindly, although that was actually common. No one in antiquity actually advised slavers to treat their slaves unkindly. So that's just kind of like normal advice. But it's pretty, obey your master. You have a master in heaven. And here it's important to know that the word Kyrios, which is also often translated Lord in Christian translations, could also mean master. So you have a heavenly master. Your master, Christ, is looking at you to see whether you obey your master. So that language that comes through in the Deutero-Pauline letters isn't actually something that Paul specifically says himself in the letters that we know that we agree he wrote.
So now I would like to shift to the Gospels. What are the Gospels' take on? Well, there's 4 Gospels. They may have differences in themselves from each other on their views on this. But what do you make of them?
So I think that this is, for me, again, even harder than talking about Paul in many ways. But I want to start actually talking about another group of first century Jews. Who are less well known, and those are the Essenes, and we know about the Essenes. They're referred to in Philo, the sort of the first century Jewish philosopher Philo, and the first century historian Josephus, and so we know Roman historian Pliny refers to them. So there's this group of Jews in the first century who are known as the Essenes, and one of the things that's said about them, not in their own writings, but that is said about them, is that they don't own slaves. And Philo says they don't own enslaved people because out of respect for common humanity. And we think we now have literature from this community. We think that most of us think, although there's not total agreement, that they are in some way associated with the group that was out on the Dead Sea at Qumran, or there's a library of documents that was found in caves. So whether or not they were living there at Qumran, that the sort of at the time of the Jewish War in 67 to 70, that many of the community's documents are, end up in caves there. And if that's the case, we do know that those communities actually did own enslaved people. So there's some consistency from these documents that we think we have from the Qumran sectarians, and also a difference between that and what is reputed about them, which is that they reject slaveholding. And that even said to reject slaveholding because it is inconsistent with this common sense of humanity. So what I want to take from that, I think this is a really important point, is that in the first century, there were Jews who could imagine that slaveholding was wrong. And there were Jews who could say in a straightforward way, this community doesn't do this. That could be imagined. That was a thing that people could imagine in the first century. And that's not something that is said in a straightforward way by Jesus or his followers, or at least in what we have passed down through tradition as what they said. And so there are very few, there aren't like, again, like what's Jesus teaching on slavery? There's no necessarily coherent view on slavery that we can necessarily put together behind Jesus' teachings. And we can start with the assumption, we assume Jesus was right, and we know slavery is wrong, so we know, and we must think he in some way disapproves of it, but that's sort of, you're assuming your conclusion, right? It's an assumption of fact introduced as evidence. It's not the strongest form of argumentation. So one of the ways I would start is not with what did Jesus say, but hey, would Jesus have even encountered slaves? Like, where would he have encountered them? And so one of the places that I think, obviously, that we have a concentration of references to his encountering enslaved people is in Jerusalem, when he goes to Jerusalem. And so that's under direct rule from Rome to Pontius Pilate. So you have Roman slaveholding establishments there. Up in Galilee, he would have encountered other slaveholding households. The Herodians owned slaves up there. There's, so he would have encountered different kinds of slaveholding in Galilee and Jerusalem. So he was encountering them. And there's this history as well of Sepphoris, which is a town not far from Nazareth, that the Roman historian Josephus, first century Roman historian Josephus, reports that after a revolt in the early first century, the Romans punished Sepphoris by reducing the entire population to slavery. So is that historically true or not? I don't know, but I think there's a good chance that Jesus grew up in Nazareth with the knowledge that his fellow Jews were being enslaved elsewhere in the empire, and also that his fellow Jews were also slavers themselves. Like, so he would have grown up. He had encounters with slavers and with enslaved people in this society, and so that's one of the first things, is just even to begin to imagine Jesus in a slaveholding society, because I think a lot of times we imagine him in a world that somehow doesn't have slaves in it, even though the Roman Empire is a vast slave racket. It's all over the place. And so he certainly would have encountered enslaved people. He encounters, and again, I'm not really even commenting on the historicity of these stories, but the way it comes through the tradition, that he encounters, one of the most common stories in the Gospels, that he encounters a centurion who has an enslaved member of the household who is sick, and the slaver wants the enslaved person to be slaved, and that Jesus does this, in fact, performs this healing is said to perform the healing at a distance. So, we can talk about how you feel about, stories about healing, stories about miracles. I mean, but there is certainly, I would say, certainly in the first century, I think as a historians, we can agree that Jesus has a reputation as a healer. And this is one of the stories about healing that comes through. And so again, like, that's up to how you're going to take that. Oh, well, Jesus heals an enslaved person. Within the way the stories are told, I would say particularly in Luke, it's really told as a favor for the centurion. It's really, the centurion asks for this, and Jesus performs it, doesn't say, and by the way, now you should free that enslaved person, but restores that enslaved person to health, which is great for the enslaved person, but also presumably great for the slaver who's relying on the labor of the enslaved person. So that would be, that's the kind of evidence we have to work with. And it's, if I were sermonizing it, which I don't preach, I have preached, I'm not a good preacher, but, I try to find some nugget that's life-giving there. But as a historian, I see someone who is, who's really not, who doesn't seem to have a track record or a public record of condemning slavery, or again, like, how could he have condemned slavery in the whole Roman world? What he might have done is say to his followers, release your enslaved people, provide for them, release them. And there's not evidence that he does that. He talks about enslaved people, slaves and slaveholders, masters and slaves, in many of his parables. And what's interesting to me is that there's all these people who've written all this stuff about parables, and they're sort of, Jesus, really evokes this agrarian world, and there's farmers, and there's seeds, and there's fishermen. Yeah, but they're actually more slaves than any of those things, right? So that the slaves really, in as much as they reflect the world of Galilee, the world they reflect is a world in which slaveholding is really, really common. And that just becomes a structure of the world that Jesus repeats. Now, Jesus is reputed to say, and again, we can get into, and I know you've talked to people on this program who are much more involved in the question of the historical Jesus than I am. I have thoughts on it, but it's not a question that's central to my own research project. So I will talk about the sayings that are attributed to Jesus. And certainly the idea that Jesus says, be slaves to one another. I would say that that is countercultural. And if everyone is enslaved to one another, then there are no masters, there are no slavers. That doesn't actually necessarily lead to people being released from slavery, but it can certainly be a place of resistance and a place of starting to undo a particular kind of thinking. So that's where I would, although that's also, I have to say, then really, really difficult, because the idea of being slaves to one another and serving one another is something that's been said to women, been said to men in marginalized groups. Oh, you should serve. This is the good thing, is to serve. This is what Jesus wants you to do, to serve. And so that has also been used to put people in their place. So that's a difficult thing. But I would say that there is a way where, if it were followed, that it would lead to a world without masters, a community without masters.
Are males and females viewed the same way in the New Testament, or are they viewed differently? Like, in terms of, like, my question is, are they viewed equally or unequally in the New Testament?
Males and females?
Mm-hmm.
Yes. Yes, they're viewed. But maybe I should talk about males and female slaves too, because that's been a big part of my work. Yes, again, there are lots of
that's what I'm asking about.
The New Testament, where I would say, where females are, there is in the resurrected Christ, there is no male and female, right? So there's a life beyond gender. Women proclaim the word, absolutely, all of that. And there are also places in the New Testament where women are told, basically, go sweep up and make dinner. So we can, once again, I think we can. It depends what kind of argument you want to make and what kind of recourse you want to have. And what I would say is, a person of faith versus a theologian versus a historian might be somewhat different things. But one of the things to know about the ancient world is, a lot of times my students think that, in the ancient world, women had no rights, whereas they do in the modern world. Well, women had more property rights in ancient Judaism and in the Roman Empire in some ways than they did in, say, the U.S. in 1920 or something like that. They had more. There were ways that women could own property and bring property. What were marriage contracts? People talk about prenups as though they're this really modern thing, and I'm like, they're the most ancient thing in the world. I mean, ancient marriage contracts were essentially prenups, where typically the bride's father would try to protect her property rights in marriage by saying, she's bringing these resources in, and if the marriage ends, she's taking it out, and this is what else she's getting, and this is what you're allowed to do, and this is what you're isn't allowed to do. So there were very definitely women were property owners in antiquity. Most women weren't probably property owners, but most men probably weren't either. But one of the one of the things I'm trying to get to is, women were also slavers. Men were slavers. They had legal title to men and women. In Acts of the Apostles, there's a scene that takes place at the house of Mary, who's a member of the very early community in Jerusalem, according to Luke, or according to the author of Acts of the Apostles. And Mary's a slaver, her slave, Rhoda, the enslaved woman, Rhoda, runs and answers, runs to the gate where Peter is. So, but from the outset, certainly we know that women as well as men were slavers in this community. And we could follow that through Christian literature, through late antiquity. I think also for a lot of people, when we hear the word slave, when I'm talking about an individual, I'd prefer to say enslaved person, but I'm not a purist about almost anything. So when we hear the word slave, I think for a lot of people envision an enslaved male. There's no reason to think that the majority of enslaved people were male, and there's some reason to think the majority of enslaved people were female. And so there's this weird thing that we get into where people refer to a slave and a female slave, and it's like, well, the slave is by default male. Like if you're gonna like a male slave, enslaved male, enslaved female. So enslaved people, there were enslaved women as well as enslaved men. So part of what I've done in my research is to show, and I think to show most people convincingly, that there was a real problem for enslaved females in the ancient world, that they were sexual property. And so they were used for reproduction, they were used for sexual pleasure, they were also used as wet nurses. There's a phrase that my students love this phrase, bargaining with the patriarchy. Certainly a lot of enslaved females were probably bargaining with the patriarchy in some ways. Maybe being used sexually by a wealthy man could get you certain kinds of protection or benefits, or would help your kid in some way that would be good, get you better food. So that would be one scale. Most people who were prostituted were enslaved. That would be another, and not, another sort of, and enslaved men were also sexually property. And so particularly for sort of pretty young men, pretty boys and pretty young men would be sexually used by people. And so on one hand, and this is one argument that I feel is that enslaved women who wanted to join the ecclesia, to join the church, had this impediment because the early church, the early community begins to draw boundaries of purity, and to demand certain kinds of sexual behavior. That enslaved people, it wasn't under an enslaved woman's ability to say no. So so that was a tension, I think, that we can begin to see. The question also, the bigger question is whether male members of the ecclesia had the expectation that they could use their enslaved members of their household sexually. And tends to be this assumption like, well, of course they wouldn't do that because it's wrong. And I'm like, well, I know it's wrong, right? Like, I know it's wrong and you know it's wrong. So, but how would they know that it was wrong? Like, it was not considered wrong in Roman culture. And then so people will say to me, well, but he was, they were following sort of Jewish norms of sex, right? Right. In first century Judaism, Jewish men could use enslaved women in their household sexually. They were permitted to do it. It wasn't necessarily applauded. It wasn't seen as like, hey, that's a great thing to do, but there were no impediments to doing it. There's no punishment. Like maybe a guy would get into a big fight with his wife about it, but there were no impediments. There were no punishments for doing it. There was no, you're not going to have to make amends to your community or offer a sacrifice or anything like that. It was permitted. It's not advocated. It's not required. It's not advocated. It's not forgiven. It's permitted. It's probably sometimes looked down on, but not in any way punished. And so the question then is, if we go into the members of the early ecclesia, how would a man who is accustomed to having sexual access to enslaved people in his household, how would he know this was wrong? And again, people will say, well, if he was married, it would be adultery. But see, in the ancient world, in Judaism, in Roman thought, adultery has to do with relations between a married man, a married woman and a man who's not her husband. And so enslaved people couldn't legally form marriages that were legally recognized under Roman law. So that was not an impediment. And a man could have sex with the following people, and it would not be adultery. A married man could have sex with a divorced woman, a widow, an enslaved person, a prostitute, someone else's daughter, and none of those would be classified as adultery. They wouldn't all be considered morally good things to do or acceptable things to do, but the category would not be adultery, because adultery had a specific meaning having to do with a married woman, sort of the property rights of a married man to his wife. So there was there was a bit of a digression, but if we're thinking about enslaved females in the church, I think it was and to a lesser extent enslaved males, there's a lot of precarity sexually, and there were few protections that were offered. For those men who followed from the outset, there were some followers of Jesus who chose not to have any sexual contact with anyone at all. And so those men were not having sexual contact with enslaved women in their household because they weren't having sexual contact with anyone. But when this begins to become a thing, when Christians begin to comment on men, and this is not in the first century, but later, men having sex with their slaves, the concern is for the moral position of the man, not the impact on the enslaved person.
So when we get to the 2nd century and the New Testament texts are becoming widespread, especially by the late 2nd century AD, what were the early church's view on these texts when it came to slavery? What were their various takes on it?
I think it was part of the world in which they lived. It was part of the world in which they lived, and they didn't. I think going back to, I've been actually doing a lot of work on Genesis and really trying to think about some of the references to slavery there. I think that they might have seen that it was a sign of disorder in the world, but it was something that day to day they just kind of accepted. It's sort of there. Certainly when you have more writers who are emphasizing sort of sexual abstinence, well, that's a double-edged sword, because it does actually mean that male slavers would not be having sex with enslaved people. But it also means that if there are these purity norms that are increasingly becoming important, then there are people who are socially situated to adhere to them and those who aren't. There are certainly, when you get into, say, the 3rd century, you're going to have theologians talk about, you should really limit slaveholding. It's seen as like a luxury thing, sort of, you really only need 1 or 2. But it's not so much a concern from the enslaved people, but that you don't want the person who's a slaver to be living this really luxurious life. Just like they shouldn't be drinking too much wine or eating food that's too rich. They shouldn't be indulging too much in sort of the softness of being a slaveholder, much more than it is concern for enslaved people. There is a really important 4th century theologian. Again, I don't want to say that he is pure in what he says or unconflicted in what he says, but Gregory of Nyssa does speak against slaveholding per se as a wrong in and of itself, and he does so very strongly, and he grounds it in the idea that all human beings are created in the image and likeness of God, which is from Genesis 1:26, 1:27. And he says, who do you think you are that you can buy and sell someone who's in the image and likeness of God? So you do have there's this one, maybe this really clear voice, not just speaking in sympathy for enslaved people, not just saying sort of mitigating the risks of slaving, but sort of speaking really against it. And there may have been others as well. There may well have been other Christian communities that we can sort of see in sort of some shadowy ways, an obscure group called for the followers of Eustathius, who may have rejected slaveholding, but most of the texts that we have sort of just accept it as the way of the world. maybe
And for my
problematic, maybe a distortion, maybe this isn't what God really accepted, but this is the world we live in, and so this is the order of things.
and for my last question, when you look at these texts, like how would you want people, I suppose, to try to read these texts more carefully, like rather than trying to go the extreme of one interpretation versus the other, like I was asking about near the
Yeah,
beginning of the show?
yeah. Um, yeah, again, I think it depends why someone is reading the text and what the context they're reading the text in. And so I would always say these texts are written in the language of their time, and they don't. I know my view of inspiration doesn't have to do with sort of the Holy Spirit whispering in someone's ear, sort of automatic writing. So people are writing these things. They're writing in the language of their time and the idiom of their time, according to the norms of their time, and those times are not our times. I guess what I would say is that people need to take responsibility for their own readings, and to the idea to say, well, I have to think this because this is what the Bible says, that the New Testament, that the Hebrew Bible are collections of writings, and those writings are by different writers over a period of many years, or in the case of the Hebrew Bible, centuries, and they reflect many points of view. And that, to me, it enriches things to understand the historical context in which these works are written. But yes, I would say people need to take responsibility for their own readings.
I'm going to see if there's a couple of questions in the chat before we close. Let's see. We'll start with Tim Eubanks. What do you make of John Dominic Crossan's discussion of a more historical radical Paul as a more anti-slavery Paul?
Gotta love it. Beautiful, really beautiful. Historically less plausible, but beautiful and appealing and romantic, and I'm very drawn to it. And I think that he gets there by ignoring certain things. But Paul does, and again, when we're reading Paul says, he quotes what's probably a formula before him. And in Christ, there is neither Jew nor Greek, there's neither slave nor female, there is not male and female. It's a very liberating passage, and we can simply begin there. And I think we come out with a different Paul than if we start with some of the more conflicted passages. Including what Paul goes on to say in Galatians, where after saying there's neither slave nor free, he completely relies on, for the rest of chapter 3 and 4, he just completely relies on the language of slave versus free, heir versus slave, Hagar versus Sarah. So I see Paul as someone who is, this is why I want to say, I don't think Paul starts off with a really coherent view about slavery. I don't think he really wants to necessarily confront certain things, but people ask him about them. And then it's sort of actually how I read Paul where people ask, where the question of veils comes up. I don't think Paul really cares about it, but he's confronted with the question, and so he has to say something. So that's how I read Paul. So I think that John Dominic Crossan has a really lovely and really romanticized view of Paul. I just don't find it historically convincing. I find it very attractive, very attractive.
And I'd like to remind everyone that I'll have the links to purchase Jennifer Glancy's books in the description below and the pinned comment. That being said, thank you very much for joining me today, Jennifer.
Jacob, this has been a real pleasure. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Hello viewers, thanks for watching this video from the History Valley YouTube channel. Please don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell. And if any of you wish to further support this channel, please consider checking out this channel's Patreon page and becoming a patron, and or donate through PayPal or through Super Chat during your live stream. Thank you.